Welcome. I'm John A. Warnick, founder of the Purposeful Planning Institute. We're excited you're joining us for a PPI Thought Leader and Industry Innovator webinar. I hope you agree with the mindset of the PPI community that our best days lie just ahead of us. To get to where we want to go, we must cultivate a beginner's mind and pursue the path of mastery, not just expertise. Our PPI Thought Leader and Industry Innovator webinars help illuminate more meaningful and powerful ways in which we serve and can grow our practices. Each webinar helps us connect, engage, learn, and inspire. If you've not already taken the bold step of joining the Purposeful Planning Institute, we hope you'll do so soon. Visit our website for additional information. And for you, our guests, and for all the incredibly talented and compassionate members of the PPI community, we remind you these recordings are intended for the use and benefit of our members and guests, and sharing webinar recordings and links without express permission from PPI is prohibited. Enjoy and thrive.
So again, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's Purposeful Planning Institute webinar. The title of today's session is Anatomy of Awe, an invitation to expand our mind and explore our boundaries. Our guest thought leaders today, Dr. Anthony Barnhart and Dr. Kateryna Sylaska. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And our host today is Stephanie West Allen, PPI's Dean of Neuroscience, Artistry, and Contemplative Practices. I have a purposeful quote that I will share, and then I'll turn it over to Stephanie to do a more formal introduction of our speakers and get us started. Our quote today is by Walter Isaacson from his book Einstein, His Life and Universe. Throughout his life, Albert Einstein would retain the intuition and awe of a child. He never lost his sense of wonder at the magic of nature's phenomena, magnetic fields, gravity, inertia, acceleration, light beams, which grown-ups find so commonplace. He retained the ability to hold two thoughts in his mind simultaneously, to be puzzled when they conflicted, and to marvel when he could smell an underlying unity. People like you and me never grow old, he wrote a friend later in life. We never cease to stand like curious children before the great mystery into which we were born. So thank you, Stephanie, for providing that excellent quote to get us started with today. And I will
thank you very much, Julie. Okay, and I want to apologize again. Let me explain what happened. I got a new computer and I thought that everything would transfer, and clearly Zoom did not. So we've had a little bit of a chaotic few moments trying to get me on at all. So I apologize that you can't see me. First of all, what I'm going to do is establish a little bit of a context about why we're looking at boundaries and awe. And then I will introduce Tony and ask him a question or two, and introduce Kateryna and ask her a question or two. And then the plan is that the three of us will have a discussion. So let me start off by explaining that in the years that I've been involved in conflict resolution, both as a lawyer and as a mediator, I've had a really continuing sharp focus on boundaries. And recently, of course, during the pandemic, with its lockdowns and other restrictive measures, I was able to see boundaries from different vantage points, as I'm sure many of the rest of us have too. And one of the many reasons that I've been drawn to the concept and practice of boundaries is because I have seen that when people, including myself, are restricted and small, dealings with others typically are restrained and confined, while interactions with others, when including clients, benefit a lot from expansiveness and a large view. And to highlight a little bit about what I mean by boundaries, I'm going to mention a distinction that is described by a wonderful writer named Susan Beth Miller. And she wrote a book called Emotions of Menace and Enchantment, Disgust, Horror, Awe, and Fascination. And she looks at some of our self boundaries. Some of them stiffen and others relax. some of them close off the world and others open us up to the world. And she looks at awe, of course, as one of the emotions that opens us up to the world. I think it's very interesting if you begin to watch your own boundaries, use some self-awareness and watch your boundaries, whether they be the ones that are expanding your world or narrowing it. Trust me, it's a very enlightening exercise. I was talking with Tony coincidentally, and I mentioned this interest in awe and its inclusion in a program I'm offering. And he told me that he was researching awe, and I was very happy when he agreed to tell us about it. He was such a hit last time, and we will link to his last interview when he was on a PPI interview. In the conversation that we had, I asked him if the trait of openness would make a person more prone to experiencing awe. And I asked that because of a couple of books I've read. One of them was Christian Jarrett's book, Be Who You Want, Unlocking the Science of Personality Change, and another book by William Todd Schultz called The Mind of the Artist, Personality and the Drive to Create. He said he didn't know, but he recommended one of his fellow professors to join us in conversation. And that's why I'm very happy to have Kateryna join us today, too. I would like to ask you, Tony, to say a little bit about yourself and then tell us about your awe research. And if you don't mind, if you could include what your definition of awe is, because I use the one that's Keltner and Haidt's definition, but I want to make sure that we're on the same page as far as how we're defining awe. Would you mind doing that?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. So I should note, I am not the awe expert in this room. Dr. Sylaska is the awe expert. I've dabbled in awe research, mostly failures. Okay. I've done some research, and Sylaska and I have collaborated on one thing, but she's the real expert in the room. As you know, I came at awe from through a really indirect path. So before I was an academic, I was a professional magician. And I think magicians are in the business of attempting to elicit awe from their audiences. Of course, there are disagreements about that, whether awe is actually what we want to produce or whether it's something more like wonder. I'll say that when I was entering into thinking about awe, I, of course, was also drawn to Keltner and Haidt's definition, which identifies awe as sort of the interplay of two factors, perceived vastness, an experience of something in the world that's beyond our knowledge, beyond our current power, usually large forces in the world, and combining that with a need for accommodation, a need to update our schemas about the world to try to accommodate this new information. That was my original approach. But if you look at the magic literature, there's all sorts of disagreement, and people will use words interchangeably that probably shouldn't be used interchangeably. And I fall into the same troubles, right? Like I use awe kind of interchangeably with wonder, kind of interchangeably with astonishment. But each of these, if you look at the literature, are defined a little bit differently. So I think wonder builds upon awe. Wonder might start with awe, but wonder, while starting with awe, has this added feature of instilling curiosity or encouraging curiosity and exploration, perhaps in service of this process of accommodation or updating these schemas. But in preparing for today, I kind of looked at some of these historical conceptualizations of awe and wonder and astonishment. And these debates about awe have a long history. Socrates talked about wonder. He talked about it as bewilderment provoked by seeing seemingly impossible contradictions in the world around us. And that's followed up by curiosity. So a need to understand this unusual experience that we've had. Descartes talked about wonder as a response to novel or unexpected objects in our surroundings. And he said that this wonder is actually dispelled by curiosity. Curiosity undoes the wonder. I think we can dispute that. And a fellow named McDougall considered wonder to be a primary emotion that accompanies this instinct of curiosity. So he was certain about labeling it as an emotion. Darwin, on the other hand, considered similar things. He looked at, he maybe used the word astonishment as synonymous with wonder, and he made it his business to figure out if you could label astonishment through facial expressions. And he noted how difficult it is to differentiate astonishment or wonder from other emotions like terror and horror and woe, pain, disgust, things that we think of as deeply negative emotions. And so I think my role in today's conversation is to be the little devil on your shoulder, Stephanie, who talks about some of the potential downsides of awe, some of the potentially negative experiences associated with awe. And that's because my approach to awe was exploration of how it can be harnessed as a tool for magicians. So I'll tell you about the one experiment that that actually Kateryna and I sort of collaborated on. It started as a student project and in collaboration with a magician who was curious about such things. So a little backstory. And my perspective on this is that awe sort of makes you stupid. When you're in it, awe makes you stupid. It makes you jump to conclusions that aren't based on solid evidence. So something I suspect Kateryna will talk about is that when you're in an awe state, you have this enhanced realization that you're like a teeny tiny little cog in this world, and that there are all of these powers in the world that are beyond you, and that you're very small in the grand scheme of things. And when you have this experience of being like just this little teeny tiny cog, you're immediately reminded of how little control you actually have in the world. And people hate this feeling of lacking control. It's a painful feeling. And so there are all these compensatory responses that people have when they're in this state of feeling like they don't have control. And one of these compensatory responses is over-detection of patterns in our environment. So in kind of a landmark study by Whitson and Galinsky, they used a laboratory technique to make people feel like they lacked control. And then they had people trying to identify subtle line drawings in white noise. So very hard to detect stimuli. And some of the images of white noise had no signals in them at all. And people who were in this state of lacking control detected all sorts of illusory patterns that weren't actually there in the noise. And this pattern detection, this illusory pattern detection seemed to be a kind of compensatory control, a way to feel like you are understanding the world around you, finding meaningful patterns, back in control. So that brings me to our research. We questioned whether if a magician elicits an awe state, will it allow them to have more control over over audience members' memories? Will they be more effective at manipulating the memories of their audience so that their audiences will misremember the magic show as being more amazing than it actually was? And so we came at this from a weird direction. We used a task called the Dees-Roediger-McDermott task, which probably like psych savvy people in the audience will be aware of, even if they don't know it by name. In the task, you're given a bunch of words to remember. And all of the words happen to be semantically related to one other word that is never actually shown. So there might be words like dream and bed and quiet and restful, and words that are all related to the word sleep, but the word sleep is never presented. And later on, you do a memory test, and people false alarm like crazy to the word sleep. They swear they saw the word sleep when they were learning those words, even though it was never actually presented. And so this task itself is about over detection of patterns, right? Like you're detecting the pattern within these words and you're completing the pattern in your mind and in your memory. And so we wanted to see whether eliciting awe would lead to people over detecting this pattern and false alarming to the word sleep to a greater extent. And we didn't find that they false alarmed more. And I think this will become a recurring theme throughout today, that there may be some replication problems. There may be some problems in the awe literature that are leading to perhaps theorizing at a rate that's faster than the actual science is progressing. So I don't know if I answered.
A popular research topic.
It really is. So I don't know if I responded to your prompt the way you wanted me to, but that's kind of my background on how I came to start thinking about awe.
It has, because one of the things you said in our conversation, and it was very provocative, but you never said anything more, is that there is a downside to it, And I thought, ever since then, I've been thinking, is this the downside? Is this the downside? So thank you for clarifying that. I won't wonder. Yes, thank you. I have lots of more questions, but I want to get to Kateryna. I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. But Kateryna, I want to ask you a question. First of all, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, but I misunderstood. I thought that your area of expertise is the Big Five, or the 5-factor personality assessment. And so my question was actually targeted on that topic. Is that a mistake, or can I ask you something about that?
You can definitely ask me both questions. So I geared up and I trained both as a social psychologist, which would be a little bit more on how emotions influence our behavior, as well as personality psychology, which gives me some credence to talk about Big Five characteristics in the 5-factor model. So I'm happy to talk about both with you.
Okay, great. First of all, like I said, I'd like you to say a little bit about yourself, and then I'd like you to, because I know that there are other personality assessments that are much more commonly known, and I personally am quite impressed with the Big Five or 5-factor assessment. And so I was wondering if you could give people an overview of what that is, including a bit about the facets, because I think one of the things that I like about it is it does have those facets or sub-factors or whatever else facets might be called. So first, a little bit about yourself, and then would you mind giving an overview of Big Five?
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So again, my name is Kateryna Sylaska. So I study both personality psychology and also social psychology. Within social psychology, I'm really interested in pro-social behavior, why we help others. And that's really what got me interested in understanding the role of emotions, and emotions such as awe, in perhaps influencing our likelihood of helping someone else. For example, some of my work looks at young adults with a chronic illness. And so one question that I asked that I'm really interested in is, well, how can young adults who are experiencing a chronic illness, how can they engage with their social support networks to get the support and help that they need while they're, perhaps in a relapse or experiencing something, some symptoms of their chronic condition. And so one way that I thought was, well, maybe if people are led to feel a certain way, that might make them more susceptible or more open to helping their peers who are experiencing chronic illness conditions. And so that was really what kind of led me down this path and sent me to explore some of this work on awe. So I can come back and talk more about awe in a bit. But to answer your question about the 5-factor model, So in personality research, the 5-factor model would be the most common personality assessment that we use as psychologists. Not in clinical settings. In clinical settings, that would be a whole other slew of measurements. But just in terms of general average person personality functioning, we focus on the big 5. So the 5 facets or the 5 factors in that model are, you can recall them by thinking of they form an acronym of OCEAN. So the first one would be openness to experience. And that's the one that Stephanie had mentioned a little bit earlier, that she was curious about its relation with awe. So openness to experience is your willingness to try new things, as opposed to someone who would be low in openness would be someone who values and thinks more about routine. So common example, you go to a restaurant, a new restaurant, you're looking at the menu, and you might see something on the menu and see, oh my goodness, I've never heard of that before. I've never seen that before. That sounds really interesting. I really want to try that. Right, I want to try something new. I want to have this brand new experience. That would be someone high in openness versus, well, I've never been to this restaurant before. I don't know what's good. I don't know what's bad. You know what, let me just stick with this. This is a staple. It's going to be a safe choice. I know I'm going to probably like it. It'll be good. And so that would be someone who's lower in openness, getting the same old thing that they always get on the menu. People who like openness tend to really enjoy travel, but just really having new experiences to flesh out their life. Second up would be conscientiousness. So this would be a person high in conscientiousness would be someone who is often on time, who has a schedule, who would have high standards, high work standards for themselves, to have intensive goal setting and work to meet those goals, versus someone lower in conscientiousness might not take deadlines as seriously, might not be as on time. I kind of jokingly talk with my students when I teach this, and I say, hey, who made your bed this morning? If you made your bed this morning, you're more likely to be higher in conscientiousness. So even just our little behavior, right? Is your room clean and tidy? Probably higher in conscientiousness. Is your room a little bit disorganized? I'm looking at Dr. Barnhart's desk, and I see his desk there's not a whole bunch of papers, kind of all in the background.
The mess is over here off camera.
So he has a conscientious and a non-conscientious side to his desk, apparently. I tease. Third up, is extroversion. So this is the one that we're probably most commonly familiar with, introversion, extroversion dichotomies. So extroverts, they gain their energy from being around other individuals, other people. So at the end of a long day, an extrovert is really excited and eager to go meet up with friends for dinner or for a drink after work at the end of the day. And that's how they're able to recharge after a long, awful day. An introvert, on the other hand, is going to want to recharge by going home, maybe curling up with a good book, maybe just vegging out on the sofa, not really talking much, just recharging internally without a whole lot of interpersonal engagement. So that's just introversion, extroversion, how we get our energy. Next up would be agreeableness. So that's thinking about how sensitive we are to conflict and how open we are with that. Are we willing to just kind of go along with the flow to avoid conflict? That would be someone high in agreeableness. Someone low in agreeableness would be less worried about causing conflict, but would be more apt to kind of share their truth in spite of how that might have some sort of negative effect. Finally, we have neuroticism. So neuroticism, also termed negative emotionality. Folks high in neuroticism tend to experience more negative emotions, tend to be higher in nervousness or anxiousness, more prone to depression. Folks lower in neuroticism, so lower in negative emotionality, would be less susceptible to some of those negative emotions, more able to kind of go with the flow and take the ebbs and flows as life kind of throws them their way. So the big five, the 5-factor model says that there are these 5 dimensions and that we all have them to varying degrees, right? I talked about being high versus low on these different dimensions, and each of them exists on a continuum, with most people falling right in the center of those and fewer people falling at the really high or really low extremes of those. But we all kind of have our own constellation across those big 5 characteristics. Psychologists, I would say, really
Go ahead.
like approach because of its associations with outcomes, with how I can talk about how it predicts specific behavior in specific situations. Some of the other models that we see more in other domains, less in psychology, but more in business and in public domains, they have less, they're less strong in terms of accurately and reliably predicting those real life behavioral outcomes.
That's one of the reasons I was attracted, and I first learned about it at an APS, Association for Psychological Science conference, that the reliability and validity was higher. And so that's why it was used. And
I will caution folks, and I will say that it's not a perfect model by any means, and how it's been, I would say, commodified more recently has raised some questions in a number of psychologists' books. If you're interested, there's a book, and I believe they made an HBO documentary called The Personality Brokers, which I highly recommend. I'll pop
the
it in the
personality
chat.
booklet, did you say?
Personality Brokers.
Okay.
I'll pop it in the chat.
Ah, okay.
But I highly recommend it. It's very good.
When you say do you have an opinion on Dr. Christian Jarrett's book about changing your personality? Or not his book, just on the notion of changing your personality? Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I do. However, it is not a quick process. It is a very slow process. Changing your personality, if you want that change to be long-standing, as opposed to, when you diet, like any fad diet, I'd say there are fad personality diets, where this idea that you can change these aspects of your personality, but they can change very readily, and they can flip back, just like we bounce back after, if we're in a bad diet. It's the same way, I would say. And so with personality, what we want to see, if we want to see the long-standing change, we want to see slow, gradual changes in behavior that can then be reinforced by the environment. And that's going to be a key piece, is making sure that we're placed in environments that are going to reinforce this new behavior. As that is then going to reinforce patterns, expectations might change. Going back to your original talking about boundaries at the very beginning of this discussion today. And so those extra supports are going to be put in place to maintain personality change. And that's really what you want to be very, very, very sure to have in place if you want anything to be longstanding.
Now, I'm sure you're acquainted with the research of Nathan Hudson, he has looked at which of the 5 are most difficult to change, and openness, evidently, the research shows, is one of the most difficult to change. Is that your understanding also? Yep,
that's what I've gathered from the research as well. Yes, yeah, openness is very persnickety. There's lots of opportunities.
I love it. Okay, go ahead.
For us to expose ourselves to new things, right? But how are we talking through? What's the internal self-talk that's happening as we're being exposed to these new experiences? And what are the people around us saying? Again, having that environmental support for these changes is going to be incredibly, incredibly crucial. And far too often, our social networks are people who are like-minded. And they're like-minded with who we already are, not who we want to become. Right. So, when behavior change, making sure that you have people around you who are going to support this new behavior is going to be crucial. But yes, personality change, absolutely possible.
I think that it would be good for us to open the discussion that we were going to have, the 3 of us, if that works for you and Tony?
Sure. In
Have
fact,
you two discussed in advance? Go ahead.
No, not really, but I have a question for Kateryna, a question that came to mind while she was talking about the Big Five. So does openness to experience generalize to openness to ideas? What's the relationship between those two notions?
Yeah,
Because that could be the pathway to awe, perhaps.
I think you're onto something there. And so, yes, so within the 5-factor model, there are 5 factors. Underneath each 5-factor, there are 6 subdimensions for each of those 5 factors. One of the 6 subdimensions for openness is openness to ideas.
Okay.
So yes, that is a component. It's about 1/6 of openness.
Okay.
This in
One
of the
openness could be this avenue of perhaps distinguishing between curiosity and awe, as you were intimating earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I was thinking about this is Lonnie Shioda has shown that people who are like dispositionally prone to awe also have a reduced need for cognitive closure. Like, they don't need to have all the answers. They don't need to know any kind of capital T truth. And that seems intimately related to like a general openness to ideas, right? Someone who doesn't need cognitive closure, probably pretty open to ideas, open to considering all manner of ideas, no matter how absurd. And so that could be.
So that's the same as comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty? Yeah. Is that? Yeah,
I think so. Yep.
Yeah. Were you asking Kateryna that?
Yes, I guess.
Good. I want to hear the answer too.
Okay, can you give that one more time?
Oh crap. So
sorry, I got lost in that.
Well, maybe I did too, because the question just kind of came to me. So Lonnie Shioda has shown that people who are dispositionally prone to awe are also less in need of cognitive closure. So if they experience a lot of awe in their lives, they tend not to feel like they need all the answers. And so I wonder if that's the way that openness relates to awe. Someone who is like open to experience and open to ideas is also more comfortable with uncertainty. And maybe that's the causal pathway that leads to a proneness to awe. I don't know. Is that a silly idea?
No, not at all. Not at all. I would say need for closure is also somewhat related to conscientiousness. And so I think there might be a little bit of overlap there where we also have to factor in level of conscientiousness. It might be some sort of interaction effect where we've got someone high in openness but low in conscientiousness, where that person might be this most dispositionally susceptible and therefore then has a different kind of psychological approach to these situations. And do I need to kind of close this off immediately versus can I deal with this ambiguity and continue forward in ambiguity? Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm thinking, and obviously, I mean, I wonder if that's one of the reasons, because we tend to want closure, don't we, as human beings, generally speaking? And I wonder if that's why one of the openness is one of the most difficult to change, because it may be more difficult to teach people comfort with ambiguity.
Yeah, I think teaching comfort with ambiguity is incredibly difficult. That's probably one of the biggest themes in social psychology, is that when ambiguous situations arise, our social kind of cognitive processes kind of just run haywire, and just kind of choose a direction and go in it. Because we don't like to deal with this ambiguity. We don't like to think too much. We are cognitive misers to our core. And so I think that might be a little tricky when it hits the ground. I don't know, Tony.
Interesting. No, it makes sense to me. I would like to hear a little bit more about how the two of you decided to collaborate on awe. Were you both independently interested in it, or were you interested in magicians, Kateryna, or how did that happen?
I was already studying awe in my lab, and awe and kind of how it relates to magic had come up, and Tony had asked for some of my thoughts on how it was related, and we kind of just had a really good discussion. And then this other project idea had come up in his conversation with another magician, and our offices are literally right next to each other. I'm not at the office right now, otherwise we would literally be sharing a wall right now. And so we have lots of informal conversations all the time. That's my memory of it. Tony,
yeah, I think that's right. This project was very strange, and I think it started. Its conception began at the 2019 meeting of the Science of Magic Association, where there were just a bunch of us who had never actually worked together, but who knew each other really well, wanted to come up with a project that we could work on. And there was a magician, a very talented magician, Jeanette Andrews, who you, Stephanie, in particular, should look into, who is really interested in understanding not just how magic works, but why magic works. And she's wanted to have a hand in research and is excited about awe and the experience of wonder. And so I think it was her interest in that topic that made us think, well, how does awe touch on magic? What are the cognitive processes that might be impacted by the experience of this awe? How might magicians be able to exploit this awe state that led to our exploration of memory? It was just something that had never been studied in the context of awe before.
When you said that you felt that, go ahead.
I had done one other awe experiment long ago that was like a massive failure in collaboration with Annie Collier, who was one of Dr. Sylaska's professors in graduate school. She is an awe researcher, and when I was a faculty member at Northern Arizona University for a few years, we decided to try a collaboration, like using magic as a mechanism for eliciting awe. And so we used both magic stimuli and sort of traditional awe-inducing stimuli in the laboratory, and wanted to see whether participants' attentional focus was broadened when they were experiencing awe, using a rather traditional cognitive task that gets at that. And it was a big old nothing. No matter how awe was induced, it had no impact on attentional focus in this kind of traditional laboratory task. So my track record with awe research, it's not great, Stephanie.
Well, when you said that you felt that maybe some of the research, awe research, is maybe not as, I don't remember exactly how you described it, but not as solid as
ahead of the science.
Yeah, well, I think there might be a file drawer problem, right? Like, I bet there are a lot of null effects out there floating around that have never been published, given my track record and some of the stories that Dr. Sylaska has told me from her own research. I suspect some of these effects aren't as powerful as we would want them to be.
I think that there are a number of supposed positive effects of experiencing awe. The only one that comes to mind right now is pro-social behavior. In other words, you are more inclusive of other people and tend to treat them perhaps more compassionately. Is that one that you suspect might not be valid, or not as valid as it's being presented? Because that's one that's really highlighted when you look at awe.
I've done a series of studies, and none of them have found any increase in pro-social behavior. which really surprised me. I was doing, at the end, I was doing direct replications of these effects and could not do a direct, and by direct replication, I mean, I'm manipulating awe in the same way. I'm having them watch the same nature videos. I'm measuring the small self in the same way that they measured the small self. I'm measuring pro-social behavior in the same situations that they're measuring pro-social behavior. So I'm matching everything as perfect as I can, and I'm still not finding the same effects.
Have you found any valid positive effect?
I have found that awe does that when people are led to experience awe, that they do have this smaller self in the ways that I have manipulated awe using these nature videos that are these kind of grandscapes, and that this tends to significantly make people feel smaller. They do also experience greater connection to others. So this sense of I'm more aligned or I am more similar to this other person. But I don't see that they're more likely to want to help or to engage or to act in a more pro-social way towards those other people. So I'm seeing differences in cognition, but differences in behavior or anticipated behavior. And that seems to be where the disconnect is happening, is when I get to behavior. Thoughts are changing, behavior isn't.
Interesting.
And I should say, Dr. Sylaska has used some incredibly powerful awe induction techniques too, that are far more powerful than the things you're reading about in the literature, like watching videos.
Can you describe a couple of them?
Yeah, so one of the ones that I worked on with a group of students and some faculty in astronomy, we have an observatory here on Carthage campus, a small one, but we have an observatory. And so I had students trained on how to use the observatory, and they took participants in and they went through like a 10-minute observatory space show to kind of get this targeted view all throughout space that would kind of spin them around and give them this very in vivo experience, thinking that, okay, making this as realistic and as interactive as possible might strengthen the effect as opposed to just watching a two-dimensional video. Nope.
That sounds, that sounds, and it was in it.
No effects on
right?
behavior. Again, our attitudes, our cognitions are changing, but not our behavior. Yeah, I've seen, right, in the academic world, it's a small one. And so I've talked with a couple of the folks. I haven't actually talked with Keltner or with Tucker individually, but I've talked with some of their co-authors that I've run into at different conferences and other events. The handful that I've talked to have not seemed surprised. I've talked with them about my lack of replication, which tells me that at least the co-authors are a little aware of some of the skepticism in the larger community researching awe.
I wonder, Julie, I think we should probably open it up to Q&A. This has been, I mean, I could talk for a long time more, but I think we should give other people an opportunity to ask these two wonderful experts questions that they might have.
Of course. Well, if anyone does have a question or a comment they would like to share, you can pop that into the Q&A or chat box. You can also raise your hand and we'll open your line. There's a question from Greg in the chat. I see 60 Minutes just did a segment on heroes and found there is brain makeup that might indicate orientation to leap to help. Familiar with any similar neurobiological work related to awe?
Julie, what did you said? Just watched a video on what? I didn't hear the topic of the video.
60 Minutes just did a segment on heroes and found their brain makeup found there is brain makeup that might indicate an orientation to leap to help. So Kateryna.
So I'm less familiar with the.
Sure, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm less familiar with the neurobiological side of prosocial behavior. I tend to stick in just behavioral research. I am aware, I know that there are, every couple of years, there's a new brain region that they say, hey, this is linked with altruism or prosocial behavior. That's tended to fizzle after a couple of years in neurobiological of research, just as they continue to do this research. I know brain research, it's so sexy, but it's short-lived in a lot of areas. So I'm waiting for something to catch on. And then I really want to be an expert in it, because I think there's promise there. I think we're just really new. And we still have quite a bit of way to go. How it's related to awe, I'm not sure. Tony, are you? Tony tends to do more on the neuro side.
I don't know about the awe relationship, but I know that there are replicated neural correlates associated with it's experiencing surprise and trying to understand the source of that surprise, right? So that need for accommodation does seem to have some pretty clear neural correlates, but I don't know the extent to which those are then correlated with the experience of awe. So when people are experiencing humor, which is about surprise, right, and reorganization of thoughts, and when they're experiencing magic, which is about surprise and reorganization of thoughts, you see when they first experience the surprise, you see all sorts of activity in prefrontal cortex, and then you see anterior cingulate cortex that attempts to accommodate, to understand what they've just experienced, and hopefully in the context of magic fails to do so. But I'll agree with Sylaska's assertion, right? Like anytime there's a difference in behavior, there's going to be a difference in brain activity. The thing that we can't point to is the causal role of that brain activity in the behavior, right? Like, is the difference in brain activity that we see in these heroes necessary for the bravery or courage or helpingness? Is it sufficient on its own? We just don't know. And the brain is this complicated dynamical system that neuroscience is often oversimplifying. And so I think it's kind of putting the wagon before the horse to identify these neural correlates before we have an understanding of the processes that are underlying awe.
And one thing that I would just say, and I haven't seen the 60 Minutes, but I need to watch it. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. This is totally up my alley. So thank you. Thank you, Greg. One thing that I would say, just on this topic, is that as a helping behavior researcher, we want to be cautious when we kind of tokenize individuals as heroes. This is part of the problem with this kind of the age of Marvel in DC Comics, is that we have all these superheroes with superpowers, and it actually has this opposite effect on prosocial behavior and helping, where it actually makes us less likely to help. We assume that there are others that are better equipped to do the helping, or have this extra bit of bravery, when really it's the everyday acts of helping. And there's been some really interesting work on this, even in children's literature, that looks at how framing of helping as either a noun, so either someone is a helper, or someone is a good helper, or good at helping. The verb framing actually leads to more prosocial behavior in children than the noun framing does. And that's just a silly little children's book. But it can have this noun versus verb framing can have a big deal. And so I always say, be careful about kind of the hero mentality and waiting for a hero, because that makes you less likely to step up and be a proactive bystander.
That's very interesting. I mean, you can think of all sorts of implications for that. I mean, I can. That's quite interesting. But then I can't think of many movies that have been made that are entertaining about the average person helping. It's not exciting, you know. So I wonder if that's why we don't see anything like that. We see these flying, bullet-resisting heroes as opposed to the average person on the street.
Although we don't know, perhaps those people were just the average person until they were put into the situation that somebody needed to help, right? Like
that's true, yeah.
To reify these heroes as having like individual differences that are meaningful neglects the impact of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Emily Bouchard has raised her hand. If you don't mind, we'd like to go to that question. So Emily, I've opened your line on our end. Please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I'm really enjoying this conversation a lot. And I'm coming to you from the Pacific Ocean in La Jolla, where I get to experience awe every day by being near the ocean. And I was thinking about all the surfers and how much they're just compelled to keep going out there, and the awe every time they catch a wave. Like there's so much in this world that I live in that's present to awe. And I was thinking about this concept from the standpoint of the families that we work with, right? Like this is such an important conversation around how do we look at ways to invite more openness, discovery, curiosity, wonder, especially when there's strong differences of opinion and where some people feel really right about it. So, I was wondering, you started off by talking about boundaries, but I didn't get a chance to really connect the boundary conversation to the awe conversation and the personalities. And I was wondering if maybe you could kind of tie that up again or say it in a way. I'm sorry if I missed it. I missed the connection of boundaries to this.
Well, I think when I was talking about this book that was written by Susan Beth Miller, which is called Emotions of Menace and Enchantment. And she was comparing disgust, horror, awe, and fascination. And she looked at horror and disgust, although they're different, they both close off boundaries. You want to get away from them, whatever it is that's causing you to feel unsafe or even make a moral judgment. Whereas awe and fascination makes you open to the world. That's a very, very concise, it's a long book. It's a wonderful book, but it was that awe is a self-boundary that opens as opposed to closes. It doesn't stiffen. It relaxes the boundaries. Does that answer your question?
So when she's exploring boundaries, it's from that standpoint of how basically the degree of openness you have towards whatever you're experiencing in the world. Because there's ways to think about boundaries in psychological terms around, healthy boundaries within relationships, and so that right. I'm just trying to tease this out a bit.
She was only comparing those four: the disgust, the horror, the awe, and the fascination. She wasn't, and the way that she chose to describe them and to contrast them was to use self-boundaries and what you do when you come upon one of these things, one of these emotions. She
my research
does seem to. Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. Finish what you were saying, Stephanie. I'm sorry.
Excuse me?
Oh, finish what you were saying. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm.
I was just going to say that I think that even what I found in my research, so the connection to others that I did find, that this perceived connection to others is stronger, so I was using a scale called the inclusion of other and self scale. And so it's this it's a scale of essentially how close do you feel to others, and it kind of gives you different examples of others. And it's just a series of Venn diagrams that are either completely overlapping and then they slowly get further and further apart. And the participant has to select which series of these Venn diagrams best describes their feeling of connection to others. And so we see that when folks experience awe, there's greater overlap in those circles than when individuals are experiencing a different emotion. So I would say if that's how we're thinking about boundaries, that's definitely, that's bearing out, at least from what I'm seeing in the research, right? This boundary between self and other is being diminished a little bit, as our self is being perceived as smaller in comparison to the vastness that surrounds us. And so our self boundary is a little bit eroded because of this grand experience that we are having.
I think, well, yeah, that's exactly what, I mean, that I think is very consistent with what she had to say in her book.
And Stephanie, it's been asked in the chat here if you could repeat the name of that book that you were referencing.
The name of the book is Emotions of Menace and Enchantment, Disgust, Horror, Awe, and Fascination. And it's by Susan Beth Miller.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll include that in the follow-up report along with the recording as well. Kateryna and Tony, there was another question in the Q&A. If we have just a few minutes, but if we could take a moment to answer that one. Grant, could awe be some sort of a survival learning mechanism? We have a 2-year-old who seems to spend half her life in awe of everything. Presumably, we experience less awe as we age.
Yes, right. I think this is where, you know, maybe Tony can chat a little bit more about this difference between awe, curiosity, wonder. I think, you know, are we separating out that a little bit? I think that might be a piece of it. But yeah, I mean, as we have more experiences in the world, we have less need to accommodate for kind of these experiences that we can't explain. We can handle much more complexity in situations and the nuance that exists as we continue on. And so in that way, yeah, theoretically, there's been a lot of theoretical work on awe, less experimental work to back up the theoretical claims, but the theories of awe suggest that it's what's considered a self-transcendent emotion. And so it's an emotion where we kind of step outside of ourselves for a moment. And that fills in line with kind of some of our boundary discussion that we just had. But with this comes the idea that while this evolved for us as kind of to take an evolutionary psychology approach, they suggest that this is one of a handful of emotions that have enabled us to come together and really facilitated social structure. So because we have these perceptions of things that are so vast, this makes us much more ready to engage with others, our potential peers, to help, you know, work against this threat, this very vast threat that is the environment or another group that we're competing for resources with. And so this kind of helped us to kind of strengthen our social bonds in this world of the unknown around us.
And I think the experience of awe could be a very salient emotional cue for when our schemas are incomplete, right? Like if Keltner and Haidt are correct that awe only arises when there's perceived vastness and a need for accommodation, well, that need for accommodation means that your schemas, to use words from social psychology, or your concepts, to use words from cognitive psychology, are incomplete. And so if we're taking this evolutionary perspective, that the resonance of that extreme emotional experience of awe tells a person, this is a place that I need to focus my attention on, a place where my schemas or my concepts are incomplete and that they need to be built out. So I could imagine all sorts of reasons why the experience of awe could be an evolutionarily endowed trait.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any other questions at this time. Looks like we have just reached the top of the hour. Stephanie, any other questions that you might have? And Tony and Kateryna, any other kind of closing thoughts or comments you would like to share with the community?
I have so many questions. I've just thoroughly enjoyed listening to them. But I'm going to turn it over to them because I could ask all day.
Well, I feel like I should let Sylaska have the last word because friendly reminder, she's the expert. I'm the dilettante in this context. But if you're interested in sort of these real world experiences of awe and real world consequences of these weird cognitive processes, I encourage you to seek out the Science of Magic Association, which I've already invoked once in this discussion. That's a place where these ideas about awe really get borne out. And we're having a conference. It's a little too late, next month in London, but scienceofmagicassociation.org is a good place to follow up if you're interested in the relationships between awe and magic and all this cognitive stuff.
Are they going to have one in the United States? Do they go back and forth between?
We go back and forth. There's a non-zero chance that I'll be hosting it again in 2024, probably in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Kateryna,
do you have?
Yeah, I would just say, there's lots online. If this is something that interests you and you want to learn some more, I say that I know that we've been critical here today of awe, but I think part of that comes from our acknowledgement of how strong and powerful situations are and the complexity of human experience and just how the science we're not there yet. We need more time before we can really understand some of these things. And so that's kind of my parting word is that, we're getting there, we're making progress, and that I think emotion does have really powerful influences on even if not our behavior, our cognitions. And I think that's powerful.